Well, welcome back, everybody. So President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa will remain on level 1 of the COVID-19 lockdown over the Easter holidays, but with some adjusted restrictions. The sale of alcohol for off-site consumption is prohibited from Easter Friday up to and including Monday, while the curfew remains the same. There have also been some adjustments to religious gatherings for Easter weekend. There's news on the vaccine front. Registrations open up next month, which is tomorrow in April. We don't know when they open, but sometime in April, with rollouts expected in May. Let's discuss the restrictions, some other announcements as well made. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole is our guest. Khaya, always good to have you. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers.
So, all right, we remain on level 1. Not too much said. So we had the president speaking to us for about 27 minutes yesterday. That was quite nice. At least it was 27 minutes. We weren't on for too long. I mean, he didn't have too much to say, did he? Not much changed.
Yeah, and remember, part of the 27 minutes was dedicated to the tribute to the legendary Bomb, which was a good thing. But I think, obviously, from yesterday, you saw a result of multiple conversations that had been had with representatives from the churches, representatives from business, and of course the healthcare considerations, which was really asking the question of whether this upcoming weekend would indeed be the trigger point that accelerates the rise of the third wave, particularly if people were to be allowed to do things as they usually would do them over a long weekend, big gatherings within the churches and traveling across the country. And some people do party for reasons that are beyond the scope of this conversation. So I do think that they did apply their minds to that, but of course, on the back of the slowing infections in the past few weeks, it would have been very difficult for them to justify anything more draconian than level 2 or level 3, for example. So I think we saw the result of a lot of conversations and a lot of concessions from the state that said, stick to this level, but with these minor adjustments.
Yeah, so minor adjustments, but adjustments nonetheless. We're obviously seeing the issue of alcohol, the off-site consumption, the sales stopping on Friday and all the way up until Monday, and then it's resuming. So Thursday you can still buy, and then you'll start again on Tuesday. I mean, many asking, what is the point of this actually? Because a lot of these places would be closed anyway because it is the long weekend. So it wouldn't be too much of a dramatic effect. Or is it just the idea to say that, you know, the president is, I suppose, giving and taking at the same time?
Look, I think there is definitely a point to it. And the point to it is that we know that there are indeed some adverse behavioral outcomes that are associated with people buying alcohol, particularly on events like this, where a long weekend tends to really see a spike in road deaths, for example, in road accidents and trauma cases. So all of those things would not have escaped the attention of the state to say, actually, we do know that we have a pre-existing suite of problems associated with how people consume alcohol. And we do know that particularly on payday weekend, which is where we are, month-end weekend, and indeed a long weekend, you are literally looking at the sum of all the inputs that tend to see a spike in the way the adverse consequences of alcohol tend to be measured. So all of those things needed to be considered. But of course, you do not want to be crippling businesses, particularly when the question was going to be asked of what is the scientific reason for an outright ban, for example, because the scientific reason can only be the fact that we're seeing a rise in infections. We haven't seen a rise in infections, so that wouldn't have been a good argument on a standalone basis. But history does indeed become the influencer that says, never mind the rate of infections, we do know what tends to happen on month-end weekend and on long weekends, particularly when people want to travel and gather as they do around Easter.
Yeah. Look, the reality is that this is going to be a very different Easter to what we experienced last year. Last year, if we all remember, we were all at home. There was nothing. I mean, I don't even think we could buy Easter eggs. It was, it was that bad. I don't think they were seen as essential items. So, I mean, it's very different. And the Easter long weekend will be in full swing compared to last year. But with obviously that prohibition of the sale of alcohol for off-site consumption, bars and taverns still operating, restaurants still serving until 11 o'clock at night. So, there still is going to be quite big gatherings. And given the likelihood of the third wave of COVID-19, I mean, do you believe that government has put enough in place to try and curb it over this weekend?
Well, when we say that there will be on-site consumption, the understanding here, or the gentleman's agreement between restaurants, taverns, and government, is that there shouldn't be a facility that suddenly has 200 people packed inside a venue that can only accommodate 200, because there are still the social distancing protocols which remain in place. There are still the capacity limitations which should still be observed. So for as long as our business in the form of restaurants, for example, stick to that agreed compact that has been in place since last year, when they came out and said, look, these outright bans are crippling us, then we shouldn't be seeing that on its own being the driver of the third wave or the spike that might be. But also, let us face it, the issue of the third wave has been mentioned long before we even said there'll be Easter weekend, whatever the case might be. So if the third wave is inevitable based on essentially how the virus has mutated and has sort of spread, then we can't seriously say that it would be this particular weekend or to be those particular facilities that become the driver or the trigger point if government has said that it's inevitable anyway. So I do think that for as long as they stick to the agreed conditions of service, to say you do the social distancing, you people must sanitize, and you may not have overcapacity, then it would mean that they're operating as they would have done so last week or the week before. The third wave is going to come. It's not going to be driven just by one sector.
No, it won't. And also, I mean, as we've been saying, this has been a call, and there have been a lot of negotiations, as you mentioned in the beginning, behind the scenes, and this announcement spoke to that. And we heard a lot of the religious leaders really urging the president to allow church services to have the ability to increase the amount of people attending. So as we've heard now, 250 people are allowed indoors and double for outdoors. So, we didn't really hear details about the size of the venue or the room or anything like that. But as you say, there has been a gentleman's agreement in place for quite some time that you need to depend on the size. I mean, you can't have 250 people packing into a tiny place. However, that's the big worry. So only an interpretation by the congregants of how much space they can social distance in. It's really up to us, isn't it?
I think the responsibility moved to leaders of churches. The SA Council of Churches, for example, is the one that needs to understand that it's in their collective interest for them to actually ensure that no churches break these protocols, because we remember at this time last year, there was indeed a church gathering in the Free State, which was identified as one of the original super spreader events that really resulted in a spike in that province in particular. And of course, you have to remember that as churches, they do not seek to operate just for one weekend in the year. They seek to operate for every single weekend. So if they do fail to adhere to the regulations and to what has been agreed on in this particular weekend, it has long-term negative consequences to them, because then you cannot stop government coming back and say, guys, we gave you an opportunity, we gave you a chance at self-regulation. You clearly couldn't be able to maintain that. You weren't able to stick to the promise. So therefore, an outright ban may be what happens over the next couple of weeks. So the churches have a vested interest in ensuring that they do actually stick to what has been agreed on. That's the first thing. The second one is that I always say, and for me, it doesn't matter what the people in authority do. It doesn't matter what the restaurant owners do. You and I as individuals should remain equally vigilant. We should remain in fear of the pandemic, because if it infects you on the basis that you were indeed at a big church gathering or you were indeed at a restaurant, you're still the one that has to deal with the healthcare effects. So you cannot then blame the restaurant owner or indeed the church leader when you walked into a venue that you could see was clearly not observing the protocols and you decided to gamble with your life. So I still think that the greater appeal doesn't go to those in authority, but it goes to every single individual that ought to understand that over 52,000 people have died locally and we still do not have a vaccination program. So there's no basis for us changing the way we've behaved over the past year.
No, certainly. I mean, we had a great scare at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, with that second wave, which was absolutely devastating. I mean, I think we're still coming to terms with how badly we really were affected. We talk about 50-something thousand deaths, but yesterday when we had a conversation with Professor Alex van den Heeven, talking to the fact that this number is more to 150 to 160,000 deaths recorded. We don't know the true extent, so we really need to take care of ourselves. Obviously, the interprovincial travel, it's allowed, but that's a big problem, and that's where we saw things started going terribly wrong at the end of last year when people were going away and going for celebrations and these super spreader events, as we talked to. You know, I'm still not too sure. I don't think Moria is taking place, but, you know, a lot of people still feel that this is a time they'd like to pray. You know, when we look at big gatherings like that, again, it's in our hands. That is the reality.
Yeah, it is. Obviously, interprovincial travel is allowed but discouraged. And I think that idea of it being discouraged is the government making a passive appeal to say, look, we're not going to stop you from traveling. We do understand the value of long weekends. We do understand the value of spiritual gatherings for people. So some people just want to travel so they can see their families, which is something that probably hasn't happened with the same level of frequency in the past year for various reasons. So the fact that it is discouraged is indeed itself an appeal from the state to say, unless it is absolutely necessary, please avoid doing it. It's in your best interest. It's in your own family's best interest. And of course, the evidence of the past year did indeed show that it was during the times when all floodgates were opened, where you may think you're healthy, you may think you're safe, and then you're suddenly transporting that virus across different provinces, and you're then infecting or affecting your immediate family that are in a completely different space altogether. So again, the issue of the eternal vigilance of the individual is, for me, the greatest non-pharmaceutical intervention that we could ever have, and we must capitalize on it.
Okay, I'm going to quickly talk to the vaccine and where we're at right now. So 251,000 healthcare workers are vaccinated. This is not our rollout. We know this is not our rollout. This is still the Johnson & Johnson trial. But we did get some good news saying that about 40 million doses of the J&J vaccine have been secured. Our president was telling that registrations will be opening online as well as on person from April. However, let's talk about government's IT infrastructure. It's been problematic in the past, and you know, we've already had goals that have been set and then pushed forward. I mean, already we had said that we wanted to reach herd immunity by the end of this year. We heard the health minister saying, all right, it's not going to happen this year. We're pushing it until, I think, the end of February next year. But so we always get told these things, but when it actually is push comes to shove, there are problems. Do you foresee this happening as well, or should we be optimistic here, Khaya?
It is the great unfortunate story that in the South African context, the ability to roll out large-scale programs of this nature is severely limited. And it's not just a question of the lack of IT infrastructure. Government's biggest problem has always been the inability to integrate whatever data it has across different platforms. This is why you and I can be fully employed and government may be aware, because they're collecting taxes from us every month. And yet, if we decide to apply for the social relief grant, the 350 Rand grant for the unemployed, the system is probably going to allow us to get through until somebody picks up the red flag much later on. In the absence of that integration, there will indeed be the unforeseen glitches, and those particular glitches will mean that there will be complaints, there will be teething problems, and I'm not sure that government has got the capacity to turn that around, to really reorientate itself and do things differently within such a short period of time.
All right, Khaya, such a joy speaking to you. I know we were going to just briefly say a word or two about Notkolo, her final bulletin. The presidency does listen, don't they? 7 o'clock,
Yes.
they may. I mean, can you believe it? I mean, 7 o'clock. I think there was just such an outcry when we heard that this address was happening at 7, but the final bulletin was at 7. They listened.
Yeah, a queen was involved. I mean, even the president has to acknowledge that, yesterday we were never going to listen to him. We're like, what, we'll catch up on YouTube. So yeah, I think that was an important moment, and farewell to her.
It is amazing. Khaya, thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us. Khaya Sithole, always a joy talking to you, chatting to us about some of the announcements that came from the president last night. And the long weekend is ahead. Take care, everyone. It's really up to us to make sure that we look after our health. Let's get the news.